The rain fell on St. Jude's home for children with a tired, persistent sigh, as if the sky itself had given up. It was a Tuesday in October, and the grey light struggled to penetrate the tall, grimy windows of the dormitory. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of damp wool, disinfectant, and the faint metallic scent of fear. For Leo, aged 9, the day began not with the sun, but with a sound, the soft, rhythmic clink-clank of his own movements. He sat up on the thin, lumpy mattress, his first conscious action to reach for the key that hung on a nail hammered into the iron bed frame. His fingers, small and nimble from years of practice, found the lock on the thin iron cuff around his left wrist. With a quiet click, he was free. He slid the chain under his pillow, a ritual as ingrained as brushing his teeth. Every bed in the long, narrow room had one. They weren't thick, menacing things from a dungeon, but slender, deceptively light chains, just long enough to allow a child to turn over in their sleep or sit up. To an outsider, they might have looked like a bizarre safety measure. To the children of St. Jude's, they were a simple fact of life, a nightly tether to their beds that ensured no one wandered, no one escaped, no one caused trouble in the dark. It was, as Matron Agnes often said in her low, flat voice, for their own protection. Leo pulled on his threadbare grey sweater and trousers, his movements economical and silent. In St. Jude's, noise was a sin. You learned to walk on the balls of your feet, to close doors without a sound, to eat without scraping your spoon against the bowl. The silence was a constant, heavy blanket, punctuated only by the shuffling of feet, the occasional muffled cough, and the sharp, authoritative voice of the matron or one of the carers. Downstairs, the great hall was just as cold as the dormitory. 50 children sat at long wooden tables, heads bowed over bowls of lumpy, unsweetened porridge. No one spoke. Their eyes darted around, monitoring the black-clad figures of the staff who patrolled the perimeter of the room like sentinels. Suddenly, a small gasp, followed by a clatter. A few rows ahead of Leo, a little girl named Clara, who had only arrived 2 months ago and still hadn't learned all the rules, had knocked over her tin cup. Water spread across the dark wood of the table, a glistening, accusatory puddle. The room went utterly still. Every child froze, spoons halfway to their mouths. Clara's face, pale and freckled, was a mask of pure terror. She looked as if she had just detonated a bomb. From the head of the room, Matron Agnes moved. She didn't hurry. Her footsteps were silent on the stone floor, a feat that never ceased to amaze and terrify the children. She was a tall, thin woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. She stopped beside Clara's seat, her shadow falling over the small, trembling girl. She didn't speak. She simply looked down at the puddle, then at Clara. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Clara began to cry, silent tears tracking clean paths down her dirty cheeks. Accidents are born from carelessness, Clara, Matron Agnes finally said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carried to every corner of the hall. And carelessness must be corrected. You know the rule. She placed a hand, not unkindly, but with an unnerving firmness on Clara's shoulder and guided her out of her seat. She didn't drag her. There was no shouting, no violence. It was worse than that. It was calm, orderly, and absolute. As they walked past Leo's table, he chanced a look. He saw Clara's wide, pleading eyes. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He knew where she was going, the quiet room. It was a converted pantry off the kitchen, with no windows and a single bare bulb that the carers rarely turned on. It was cold, and she would be left there alone. No food, no water, until Matron decided the lesson had been learned. It could be hours. Sometimes it was a whole day. The punishment wasn't pain. It was cold and it was silence. After they were gone, breakfast resumed as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had changed. The silence was heavier now, laced with a shared, unspoken dread. This was how St. Jude's worked. It wasn't a place of overt brutality, that would leave obvious marks for a visiting doctor to find. It was a place of psychological precision. The chains at night prevented escape. The enforced silence prevented camaraderie. The swift, isolating punishment for the smallest infraction prevented rebellion. It was a system perfected over years, a quiet, orderly hell disguised as a well-run institution. Later that afternoon, a car pulled up the long, gravel driveway, an unusual sight. A man in a clean suit, carrying a leather briefcase, was greeted at the door by Matron Agnes, a benefactor, perhaps, or a man from the council. The children were rounded up in the common room, their tattered books placed in their hands. "Be still. Be respectful. You represent St. Jude's," the matron warned, her gaze sweeping over them like a searchlight. The man smiled warmly at them, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He spoke to the matron about funding, about the importance of community support. He saw a room of quiet, disciplined children. He saw order. He didn't see the fear behind their vacant stares. He didn't hear the silence that screamed louder than any cry for help. As he was leaving, he paused and patted Leo's head. "You're a quiet lad," he said, his voice kind. "Keep up the good work." Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. The words were right there, lodged in his throat. "Help us. She chains us. She locks us in the dark." But he looked past the man and saw Matron Agnes standing by the door, her expression unreadable but her eyes fixed on him. The moment passed. Leo gave a small, stiff nod. The man smiled again, oblivious, and walked out the door, the heavy oak closing behind him with a final booming thud, sealing them back inside their world. Before the silence, there was noise. Not the joyful noise of a happy home, but the chaotic, unmanaged hum of neglect. St. Jude's Home for Children, 27 years before Leo's silent defiance, was a different kind of prison. It was one ruled by weary indifference rather than cold, calculated control. The head of the home was a man named Arthur Henderson, a stooped, graying figure whose kindness had long been eroded by exhaustion. The paint on the walls was peeling, the floorboards creaked with the ghosts of 1,000 hurried footsteps, and the evenings were a cacophony of squabbles, cries, and the restless energy of children left to their own devices. Among the small, underpaid staff was a junior carer named Agnes. Even then, in her late 20s, her posture was ramrod straight, her dark hair pulled back into a severe bun that seemed to tolerate no stray strands. While others sighed and turned a blind eye to the minor anarchies of the dormitory, Agnes watched. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. The stolen biscuit, the whispered insult, the child who shivered in a threadbare blanket. She saw it all not as childhood, but as disorder, a disease that needed a cure. She rarely raised her voice, her disapproval a palpable force that could quell a skirmish with a single, icy stare. Mr. Henderson saw her as a vision. The children saw her as a shadow that fell cold on their skin. There was a boy, then named Thomas, a lanky 10-year-old with a thatch of unruly red hair and eyes that held a desperate, frantic spark. He wasn't a bad child, merely one who could not be contained by walls. He was a creature of motion, always fidgeting, his legs bouncing under the dining table, his fingers tapping out silent rhythms on the windowsill. He spoke often of the world outside, of forests he'd only seen in books, and a sea he'd never smelled. His restlessness was a constant thorn in the side of the staff, and a particular point of focus for Agnes. To her, Thomas was the ultimate symbol of the home's failure, a soul that refused to be institutionalized. One evening, during the sparse meal of watery stew and stale bread, Thomas was caught trying to smuggle a crust in his pocket. Mr. Henderson just sighed and waved a dismissive hand. "Leave it, Thomas, just eat your dinner." But Agnes's eyes locked onto him. She said nothing, but the look was a promise. Later that night, as the children settled into their lumpy beds, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies, Thomas whispered his plans to the boy in the next bed. "I'm going to see the ocean," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "There are ships there, big ones." The night was cold, a biting November wind rattling the window panes and slicking the world outside with a sheath of freezing rain. The dormitory was a sea of shallow, fitful breaths. No one heard the faint creak of Thomas's bed springs, nor the whisper-soft scrape of the window being eased open. He was small for his age, slipping through the gap like a stray cat into the unforgiving darkness. He carried nothing but the dream of a distant shore. His absence was discovered at dawn. The empty bed, the open window letting in the frigid air, it sent a wave of panic through the home. Mr. Henderson's face, already lined with worry, seemed to crumble. Staff members ran about, their voices sharp with alarm. They found him 2 hours later, less than a mile away, huddled in a ditch by the side of the road. His small body was stiff, his skin a pale, marbled blue. The freezing rain had been too much. The official cause was exposure to St. Jude's. The cause was chaos, disorder. The fallout was immediate and brutal. An emergency meeting was called with the grim-faced local parish board that oversaw the home. Mr. Henderson, broken and weeping, took full responsibility. He was thanked for his years of service and quietly forced into an early retirement, a man undone by a single night of tragedy. In the vacuum of leadership, Agnes stepped forward. She wasn't emotional, she was prepared. She stood before the board, a file in her hands. Her voice was low, steady, and devoid of pity. She spoke of a fundamental lapse in security and the predictable outcome of an undisciplined environment. She didn't blame Mr. Henderson directly. She blamed the system he oversaw. The board members, terrified of a lawsuit and public scandal, listened intently. "We cannot allow sentiment to compromise safety," Agnes stated, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "We need structure. We need absolute accountability. We need to guarantee that no child can ever put themselves in such danger again." Her solution was laid out in chillingly practical detail. A schedule of rigid silence, punishments for minor infractions to deter major ones, and at night, a final foolproof measure. "Physical restraints," she said, the words landing like stones in the quiet room. "A simple chain and lock on each bedstead, an anchor. It is not for punishment, but for protection. A guarantee that every child is safe in their bed until morning." There were murmurs of shock, but Agnes's cold logic was a powerful antidote to their fear. It was extreme, yes, but it was a solution, an answer. They approved it. Within a week, Agnes was the new matron of St. Jude's. The first delivery arrived on a Tuesday, 3 heavy wooden crates. Inside, nestled in straw, were spools of light steel chain and dozens of small brass padlocks. The staff looked on, a mixture of horror and grim relief on their faces. The era of noise was officially over. That night, Matron Agnes walked the length of the dormitory as the children lay in their beds, their faces pale with confusion and dread. A very young Leo, barely 5 years old, watched from his cot, his thumb in his mouth. He didn't understand what was happening, only that the air felt heavy and cold. One by one, Agnes and a grim-faced caretaker moved from bed to bed, wrapping a chain around the iron footboard and securing the other end to a metal cuff on each child's ankle. The sound was sharp, definitive, a series of clicks echoing in the now silent room, sealing them in. When it was done, Matron Agnes stood at the doorway, surveying her work. The wind had died down outside, and the moon cast long, barred shadows across the floor. There were no whispers, no fidgeting, only the faint, rhythmic clink of metal as a child shifted in their sleep. She saw not a room of shackled children, but a sanctuary of perfect, unassailable order. It was safe. It was controlled. It was the beginning. 27 years before Leo ever felt the cold kiss of iron on his ankle, St. Jude's home for children was a different kind of hell. It wasn't a hell of silent, ordered terror, but one of raw, unchecked chaos. The headmaster, Father Michael, was a man whose kindness was as vast as his inability to command a room. His hair was a perpetually messy silver halo. His cassock often stained with a child's spilled milk or finger paints. He believed that love was enough, that these broken children, flotsam from the shipwrecks of other lives, needed gentleness above all else. He was wrong. The nights were the worst. The dormitories, cavernous rooms with peeling paint and windows that rattled with every gust of New England wind, were lawless territories after lights out. Whispers bled into arguments, arguments into scuffles. Children cried from nightmares, from loneliness, from the simple, aching misery of being a child with no one to call their own. The handful of overworked carers, exhausted and underpaid, could only plug one leak as three more sprang elsewhere. It was a place teetering on the edge of collapse, held together by frayed threads of charity and Father Michael's desperate prayers. Among the staff was a junior carer named Agnes. She was young, sharp-featured, with eyes that saw not children, but problems to be solved. While others saw rambunctious boys and tearful girls, Agnes saw inefficiency, risk, and a profound systemic failure. She moved through the chaos with a rigid posture, her lips a thin, hard line of disapproval. She documented every incident in a small, black notebook: a window broken during a pillow fight, a child who slipped on a wet floor, a fight over a stolen toy. To her, these were not childhood mishaps. They were data points proving the system's inadequacy. The cacophony of the dining hall was a physical assault on her senses, the constant, low-level anarchy an affront to her very being. She craved out of the way a drowning man craves air. Her obsession found its focal point in a boy named Thomas. He was a scrawny, quiet 10-year-old with perpetually startled eyes, a runner. At least once a month, he would vanish. He'd slip out a side door or climb a low section of the fence, not out of malice, but from a deep, instinctual need to flee. He was always found within a few hours, huddled in a bus station or shivering in a park, and brought back to the familiar chaos of St. Jude's. Each time, Father Michael would wrap him in a blanket, give him a cup of warm cocoa, and speak to him in gentle, pleading tones. Agnes would watch, her jaw tightening. She saw it as rewarding failure, encouraging a dangerous habit. The catalyst came on a brutal night in late November. An early nor'easter had descended upon the state, burying it in a sudden, thick blanket of snow. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving icy pellets against the rattling windows of the orphanage. Inside, the usual nightly drama unfolded. A fight broke out in the boys' dormitory, distracting the carer on duty. In the confusion, no one noticed the small shadow that slipped down the fire escape. No one noticed Thomas was gone. It wasn't until the morning headcount that the alarm was raised. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the morning routine. Father Michael's face, usually flush with weary warmth, turned ashen. Search parties were organized, the local police notified. Agnes did not join the search. Instead, she went to her room, opened her black notebook, and began to write. They found Thomas 2 days later when a thaw began to set in. He was less than a mile away, curled in a hollow beneath the roots of a great oak tree, a dusting of melted snow on his threadbare coat. He had died of exposure. The official report was a tragedy, an unfortunate accident. But for Agnes, it was validation. It was the ultimate, irrefutable data point. The atmosphere at St. Jude's became thick with grief and guilt. The parish board, a collection of well-meaning but distant local figures, descended in a flurry of panic. They saw a scandal brewing, their comfortable community project suddenly tainted by death. Father Michael was broken, a captain who had gone down with a ship he didn't even realize was sinking. He had no answers, only sorrow. This was Agnes's moment. She requested a meeting with the board, presenting herself not as a grieving carer, but as a strategist. She stood before them, calm and composed, her black notebook in hand. She didn't speak of sadness. She spoke of liability. She laid out the chaos, the lack of discipline, the predictable, inevitable outcome of Father Michael's weakness. Thomas's death was not an accident, she said. her voice clear and devoid of emotion. It was a symptom of a disease of disorder. We cannot love these children into safety. We must structure them into it. We need discipline. We need control. We need to ensure that no child can ever put themselves in harm's way again. She then unveiled her plan, a rigid clockwork schedule, a system of swift, uncompromising punishment for infractions, and the centerpiece, her final shocking solution to the problem of runaways and nighttime chaos. For their own protection, she explained, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members, they must be secured in their beds at night, not as a punishment, but as an assurance, a guarantee of their safety, an embrace of steel to keep them from the cold. Desperate to quell the crisis and impressed by her cold confidence, the board agreed. They saw a solution, a way to prevent this from ever happening again. Father Michael was quietly moved to a parish upstate, a broken man relieved of his duties. Agnes, the junior carer, was promoted to matron, given absolute authority over St. Jude's. The first night of the new regime was silent. The children, accustomed to noise and movement, were bewildered. After their meager, silent supper, they were marched to their beds. Matron Agnes walked the aisle, followed by a caretaker carrying a heavy canvas bag. From it came the haunting, metallic clink of chains and locks. Fear, a new and different kind of fear, rippled through the room. One by one, a light chain was looped around an ankle and secured to the iron bed frame. There were tears, whimpers of protest, but one look from the matron's flinty eyes was enough to silence them. The chaos was gone. The noise was gone. In their place was an orderly, oppressive silence, punctuated only by the soft clinking of iron. Matron Agnes stood at the door, surveying her work. This was not cruelty in her mind. This was salvation. This was the beginning of order. This was the night St. Jude's truly became a prison, built on the ghost of a boy who had only wanted to run away. 27 years ago, St. Jude's Orphanage was not a place of silence. It was a place of noise, not the joyful noise of a well-run schoolyard, but the relentless, grating din of chaos. Located on the outskirts of Burlington, Vermont, the rambling Victorian building echoed with the shouts of unsupervised children, the slam of doors, and the weary, frayed voices of a skeleton staff who had long ago surrendered to the tide of pandemonium. The air, thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and damp wool, was a testament to well-meaning neglect. The orphanage wasn't malicious, it was simply overwhelmed. In the midst of this, anarchy moved a young junior carer named Agnes. While other staff members like the matronly Mrs. Gable rushed about with perpetually flushed faces, trying to put out proverbial fires, Agnes moved with a chilling deliberation. She was a stark figure of order in a world of disarray. Her dark hair was always pinned in a severe, unmoving bun. Her uniform was impossibly crisp. While children ricocheted off the walls around her, she would focus on a single smudge on a window pane, rubbing it with a focused fury until it disappeared. She saw the chaos not as a challenge to be managed, but as a disease to be eradicated. Her lips were a thin, permanent line of disapproval. Her quiet contempt was most often directed at boys like Thomas. At 10 years old, Thomas was a ghost in the machine, a boy who had mastered the art of being invisible. He was slight of build, with wide, watchful eyes that seemed to absorb the surrounding turmoil without reaction. He didn't run or shout. He found small, forgotten corners, behind a dusty bookshelf in the library, under the crooked stairs leading to the attic, and would sit for hours, tracing the faded lines on a creased photograph of a man and woman he barely remembered. The address on the back of the photo, a small town just 30 miles away, was a scripture he had memorized. The noise of St. Jude's wasn't just an annoyance to him. It was a constant, roaring reminder of everything he had lost. As October bled into November, a brutal cold front swept down from Canada, encasing Vermont in an early, unforgiving winter. The wind howled through the ill-fitting window frames of St. Jude's, and the ancient boiler in the basement clanged in protest, offering only lukewarm resistance to the creeping frost. The chaos inside the orphanage intensified. Children, cooped up by the weather, grew more restless. The staff, already thin, was stretched further by seasonal sickness. It was during this period of heightened disorder that Thomas made his decision. He watched his chance unfold during the evening meal. A fight broke out between two older boys over a bread roll, drawing the attention of the two carers on duty. In the ensuing commotion, a tray of watery soup was appended. As Mrs. Gable rushed to clean the mess, her back turned, Thomas slipped away from the table. No one saw him pull on his thin, threadbare coat. No one saw him ease open the squealing kitchen delivery door. He stepped out into the biting wind, the photograph clutched tight in his hand, and was swallowed by the rapidly falling dusk. The door clicked shut behind him, its sound lost in the dining hall's clamor. It wasn't until bedtime, during the haphazard headcount, that his absence was noted. "Has anyone seen Thomas, Mrs. Gable asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. A few children shrugged. No one knew. A flicker of annoyance turned to a knot of concern in her stomach. A frantic, disorganized search of the building began. Closets were thrown open, beds were checked, his small corner behind the bookshelf was empty. Panic began to curdle the air. The local police were called, but the response was slow. A snowstorm had begun to blanket the region, reducing visibility and making any immediate, large-scale search impossible. All night, Mrs. Gable sat by the phone, her face ashen, while Agnes stood by the main hall window, staring out at the swirling white abyss with an unnerving placidity. The call came just after dawn. A dairy farmer, checking his fences on the edge of town, had found him. Thomas had made it less than 5 miles. He was curled at the base of a large oak tree, as if he had simply laid down to rest. The photograph was still clutched in his frozen hand. The tragedy shattered the fragile equilibrium of St. Jude's. An emergency meeting was called with the orphanage's board of directors, 3 local businessmen who managed the institution's funding with detached benevolence. They sat grim-faced around a large mahogany table, facing a distraught Mrs. Gable, who wept openly. Agnes was also present, at the back of the room, a silent observer in black. It was the system, a voice cut through the grief, sharp and clear as ice. All eyes turned to Agnes. She stepped forward, her expression not of sorrow, but of resolute certainty. "Mrs. Gable is not to blame. We are all to blame for allowing this disorder to fester. We called it freedom. We told ourselves the noise was the sound of childhood. We were wrong. Chaos is not kindness. Freedom without safety is a death sentence." She held the board's gaze, her confidence absolute. They were shaken, guilty, and desperate for a way to mitigate the inevitable scandal. Agnes offered them one. "Order is not cruelty. It is protection," she continued, her voice hypnotic. "Structure is not oppression, it is care. These children need boundaries. They need to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that they are secure, especially at night, alone in the dark." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I propose a new protocol, a system of unwavering safety. Each child secured in their bed at night, not as a punishment, as a promise that they will never wander into the cold. A promise that they will be here to greet the morning sun. Think of it as a parent's embrace, forged in steel." The room was silent. Her proposal was monstrous, yet she framed it as the ultimate act of protection. She wasn't a hysteric. She was a savior with a plan. The board members, relieved to be offered a concrete, decisive action, a way to ensure this never happened again, latched onto it. Within the hour, the motion was approved. Mrs. Gable was granted an early, enforced retirement. Agnes was promoted to matron, effective immediately. That night, for the first time, St. Jude's fell silent. The clinking of metal was the only sound as new, heavy chains were fastened to the leg of each bed and then locked around the ankle of each child. Their confusion and nervous whispers quickly faded into a stunned, fearful quiet. Matron Agnes walked the dormitory aisle, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. She surveyed the rows of still, shackled forms, her face, for the first time, betraying an emotion, a deep, unnerving serenity. Her new era of order had begun. The silence that followed the benefactor's departure was heavier than the one that preceded it. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from disappointment and reinforced fear. The polished floors of St. Jude's gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights, reflecting the perfect order Matron Agnes had presented, a lie so convincing it had become their reality. For Leo, the shine of the floor felt like a mockery. He had stood there, a few feet from a man who could have been their savior, and had let the matron's icy glare freeze the words in his throat. The shame was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The next morning, the knot tightened. During breakfast, a meal consumed with the usual mechanical silence, the door to the dining hall creaked open. Two senior carers entered, flanking a small figure. It was Clara. The room didn't stir, but every eye darted towards her before snapping back to their bowls of watery oatmeal. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, and dark circles bruised the space beneath her eyes. She moved with a shuffling, uncertain gait, her hands clenched at her sides, as if holding onto the last fragments of herself. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, a few feet ahead of her, as if navigating a treacherous path only she could see. They sat her at her usual spot, next to an older girl who instinctively shifted an inch away. Leo watched her, his heart pounding a painful rhythm against his ribs. He wanted to say something, anything, "I'm sorry, are you okay?" But the rules were etched into his bones. Unnecessary talk was a transgression. Showing concern was a weakness. He could only watch as Clara stared blankly at her untouched breakfast, her small body rigid with a trauma that had no name in their world, but was understood by all. Later that day, a new presence entered their meticulously controlled environment. Matron Agnes called an assembly in the main hall. Standing beside her was a young woman with kind eyes and a nervous but warm smile. She had soft brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wore a colorful sweater that seemed offensively cheerful against the muted grays and beiges of St. Jude's. "Children," the matron's voice was crisp, cutting through the air. "This is Miss Sarah Jenkins. She is our new junior carer. You will show her the same respect and obedience you show all staff." The introduction was devoid of any warmth, a sterile transaction. "Miss Jenkins comes to us with new ideas, but she will soon learn that our methods are what ensures this home runs with peace and security." There was a subtle emphasis on our methods, a clear warning directed at the newcomer. Sarah stepped forward, her smile widening slightly. "Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and get to know all of you." Her voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the matron's metallic tone. No one responded. They just stared, their faces blank masks of compliance. Sarah's smile faltered for a second, puzzled by the wall of silent, expressionless children before her, but she quickly recovered. Her first day was a study in frustration. During the designated recreation hour in the barren yard, she tried to initiate a game of tag. The children simply looked at her, then at the carer on duty, waiting for permission that never came. She tried reading a storybook aloud, her voice full of animated character voices, but her audience remained unnervingly still, their postures perfect, their eyes vacant. It was like trying to plant flowers in concrete. They were not children, they were statues conditioned to stillness. It was then that she noticed Clara, sitting alone on the cold steps, tracing invisible lines on the dusty ground with her finger. She was completely separate, cocooned in a bubble of misery. Driven by an instinct Agnes was determined to stamp out, Sarah approached her slowly, kneeling to her level. "Hi there," she said softly. "My name is Sarah. What's yours?" Clara flinched, pulling her hand back as if she'd been burned. She hugged her knees to her chest and refused to look up. "That's a pretty pattern you're making." Sarah tried again, her voice gentle. "Can I see Miss Jenkins?" The voice came from behind, sharp as broken glass. Matron Agnes stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. A word! Sarah stood, her cheeks flushing. She followed the matron into the sterile hallway. That child, Clara, Agnes began, her voice low and menacing. She is undergoing a period of correction. Your coddling undermines my work. It creates weakness. Here, we build resilience through discipline, not misplaced sentimentality. Do you understand? I was just trying to, Sarah started, her idealism clashing with the cold reality of the woman before her. You were interfering, Agnes cut her off. These children require structure, not friendship. They are not your pets. Observe, learn our ways, and do not deviate from them again. Defeated, Sarah returned to the yard, but the interaction had been witnessed. Leo had seen the whole thing from the other side of the yard. He saw the kindness in Sarah's face, an expression so foreign in this place it felt like a dream, and he saw the way the matron had extinguished it with a few cold words. For the first time, he didn't just feel fear of the matron. He felt a hot spark of anger on behalf of the new carer. The day concluded as it always did. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the grounds, the children were marched to their dormitories. The senior carers moved down the aisles with practiced efficiency, their keys jangling, a sound that signaled the end of another day of survival. Sarah, assigned to evening duty in Leo's dormitory, watched in stunned silence as the first carer unlocked a heavy chain bolted to the leg of a bed. The carer then secured the cuff around a boy's thin ankle. A quiet, metallic click echoed in the silent room. Sarah's mouth fell open. She looked from the chain to the boy, who submitted to the ritual with a weary resignation, then to the next bed, and the next. It was a production line of subjugation. What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. The senior carer, a grim-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, didn't even look at her. "Matron's orders, it's for their own safety. Prevents wandering." "Safety?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "They're children. You're chaining them like animals." Mrs. Gable finally turned, her eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "We had a wanderer once, a long time ago. He never came back. Matron Agnes ensures that never happens again. You're new. You'll get used to it." But Sarah knew she wouldn't. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening to the rhythmic clink-click of lock after lock. The sound was the heartbeat of St. Jude's, and it was the sound of her own naivety being shattered. She looked at Leo as the cold metal was fastened around his ankle. For a fleeting second, his eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not just fear, but a desperate, silent plea that she now understood completely. 27 years before Sarah Jenkins ever set foot in St. Jude's, the orphanage was a place of benign neglect, not calculated cruelty. It was run by Matron Elspeth Gable, a woman whose soft, wrinkled hands trembled slightly when she poured tea, and whose authority had long been eroded by age and fatigue. The halls, built of sturdy New England stone that seemed to sweat in the humid summers, echoed with the cacophony of childhood. Shouts in the yard, unsupervised scuffles over toys, the constant, low-grade hum of chaos. The linoleum was scuffed, the paint was peeling, and the budget was always a whisper away from empty. But the children were not afraid. They were unruly, often hungry for more than the meager portions provided, but they slept in their beds untethered, their dreams their own. Among the small, weary staff was a woman named Agnes. In her late 30s, she was a stark contrast to Matron Gable. Where Gable was soft and yielding, Agnes was sharp and rigid. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun so severe it seemed to pull at her temples, and her carer's uniform was always immaculately starched, a crisp white shield against the disarray surrounding her. She observed the chaos not with weary resignation, but with a cold, simmering resentment. She saw waste, inefficiency, and weakness. She saw children who needed not coddling but discipline. "A firm hand is a guiding hand, Elspeth," she'd say, her voice clipped and precise, whenever Matron Gable would sigh over a broken window or a fist fight. Elspeth would just pat her arm. They're just children, Agnes. They need room to be. Agnes would just smile, a thin, bloodless line that never reached her eyes. One of those children was Thomas, a wiry 10-year-old with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a spirit that chafed against the confines of the orphanage walls. He wasn't a bad boy, just a restless one. He would collect maps from discarded magazines, tracing routes to cities he could barely pronounce, whispering names like Chicago and Santa Fe as if they were incantations. He'd run away 3 times. Once, he was found 2 miles down the road, trying to hitch a ride. Another time, he was discovered sleeping in a farmer's hayloft. Each time, Matron Gable would greet his return with a tired lecture and a bowl of warm soup. For Agnes, it was a galling display of incompetence. She saw Thomas not as a dreamer, but as a flaw in the system, a loose cog that threatened the entire machine. On a raw, windswept night in late October, Thomas vanished again. A storm had rolled in off the Atlantic, lashing the orphanage with sheets of rain that rattled the old window panes. In the morning, his bed was empty, a single comic book left on his pillow. At first, there was the usual routine, annoyance, a few calls to the local sheriff. But as the day wore on and the rain refused to cease, a real, gnawing anxiety began to set in. Matron Gable's face grew pale, her usual frailty replaced by a stark, maternal fear. Staff and older children were organized into search parties, their jackets soaked through as they trudged through the muddy fields and dense wood surrounding St. Jude's. Agnes did not search. She stayed inside, organizing the dormitory, her movements methodical and calm. She was preparing for the inevitable, seeing the outcome not as a tragedy but as an opportunity, a validation of everything she believed. It was 2 days later when a state trooper found him. Thomas had tried to shelter under a rocky outcrop near the creek, but he'd slipped in the mud and fallen. The cold and the relentless rain had done the rest. The news fell upon St. Jude like a physical blow. Matron Gable collapsed into a chair, her sobs echoing the grief and guilt that paralyzed the rest of the staff. The children were quiet for the first time in memory, the air thick with a loss they couldn't fully comprehend. In the midst of this devastation, Agnes was a pillar of chilling composure. While others wept, she wrote. She compiled a report, her handwriting a model of clarity and precision. She documented Thomas's previous escapes, Matron Gable's gentle reprimands, the lack of secure nighttime protocols. She didn't have to shout or point fingers. Her meticulously crafted narrative did it for her. It painted a picture of a catastrophic failure born of sentimentality and weakness. She presented her report to the orphanage's board of directors a week later. They were somber, shaken men, desperate to deflect public blame and ensure such a thing never happened again. Matron Gable sat beside her, looking defeated and a decade older. "This was a tragedy," Agnes began, her voice steady and filled with a somber authority. "But it was a preventable tragedy. We speak of giving children room to be, but we failed to give Thomas the one thing he needed most, safety. We failed to protect him from his own impulses. Leniency did not save him. It cost him his life." Her solution was simple, severe, and presented as an act of profound responsibility. For the children's own protection, she argued, to ensure no child can ever again wander into the darkness while we sleep, we must implement a system of nighttime security. A physical restraint is not a punishment. It is a safeguard, a guarantee that every child who goes to sleep in their bed will wake up in it. The board, haunted by the image of a small boy lost in the storm, listened. Agnes's cold logic was a balm to their panicked consciences. It sounded like strength, like control, like a solution. Elspeth Gable was offered a quiet, immediate retirement. Agnes, the voice of reason and security, was named the new matron. Her first act as matron was to oversee the new protocol. That night, a heavy canvas sack was brought into the boys' dormitory. From it, a maintenance man pulled out a set of thin, steel chains, each with a small lock. The sound of the metal clinking together sliced through the tense silence. The boys watched, their eyes wide with a new and unfamiliar terror. Agnes walked down the aisle, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She stopped at the first bed. "For your safety," she said, her voice soft but absolute, as the cold chain was looped around the bed frame and then clicked shut around a small boy's ankle. The sound of the lock clicking echoed the closing of a door, not on a room, but on an entire era. St. Jude's was finally quiet. It was the sound of order. It was the sound of fear. And in the silence, Matron Agnes knew she had finally brought salvation. The evening air was thick with the familiar dread of lockdown. The metallic clink of chains being laid out by the beds echoed in the dormitory, a sound as routine as a lullaby in hell. Leo lay stiffly on his cot, his eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling, willing himself to be anywhere else. He had helped Sarah, smuggling out the small, worn notebook he'd found tucked away in the library, a logbook from the old matron, filled with heartbroken entries about a boy named Thomas and Agnes's dangerous new ideas. He had placed all his hope in that act, a fragile seed planted in a world of concrete. But as the minutes ticked by, that hope began to wither. Agnes patrolled the aisle, her presence a cold front, her gaze sweeping over them like a prison searchlight. Then, a sound broke the ritual. Not the familiar creak of the floorboards or the whisper of a frightened child, but a sharp, authoritative knock on the main doors downstairs. It was followed by another, louder this time. Agnes froze, her hand hovering over a chain. A rare flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The children exchanged nervous glances. Unscheduled visitors were unheard of after dusk. Heavy footsteps sounded in the main hall, followed by firm, unfamiliar voices. Sarah Jenkins appeared at the dormitory doorway, her face pale but resolute. Behind her stood two uniformed police officers and a stern-looking woman in a trench coat, who introduced herself as Miss Albright from the State Department of Child and Family Services. Agnes drew herself up, her features hardening into a mask of professional indignation. "This is a private institution," she snapped. "You have no right to barge in here at this hour. You are frightening the children." "We have every right, Matron Agnes," Miss Albright said, her voice cutting through the tension. She held up a warrant. "We've received a credible report, backed by substantial evidence, of severe child endangerment at this facility." Her eyes swept the room, landing on the chains laid out on the floor. A wave of revulsion washed over her face. "My God," she whispered, looking at Sarah with newfound respect. "It's all true." The facade Agnes had maintained for 27 years shattered in an instant. The police officers moved into the room, their expressions grim as they took in the scene. One of them knelt, picking up a heavy iron cuff. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously low, "what is the meaning of this?" Agnes's composure cracked. "Safety," she shrieked, her voice echoing the same desperate justification she'd used nearly 3 decades ago. "To keep them safe. One got out once. He ran, he didn't understand. Thomas, he died because he was not secure." Her eyes were wild, darting between the officers and Sarah, the source of this betrayal. "She did this," Agnes pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. "She's a sentimental fool. She doesn't understand the discipline required." "The discipline required, miss," Albright repeated, her tone dripping with contempt, "does not involve chaining children to their beds like animals." She turned to one of the officers. "Secure her, and get bolt cutters up here." Now, for Leo, watching from his bed, it was as if the world was tilting back onto its axis. The sight of Matron Agnes, the unshakable monolith of their lives, being calmly but firmly escorted out of the dormitory was surreal. Her final, sputtering protest faded down the hallway, replaced by the decisive, metallic snap of bolt cutters. One by one, social workers and officers moved through the room, not with menace, but with a quiet, focused purpose. They didn't just cut the chains that were already fastened on a few of the younger children. They gathered every single one, removing them from the room as if clearing away toxic waste. When a kind-faced social worker approached Leo's bed, he flinched instinctively, but she simply smiled and gently moved the unused chain from his bedside table. "You won't be needing these anymore," she said softly. Sarah was moving through the room, her arms wrapped around a sobbing Clara, murmuring words of comfort. When her eyes met Leo's, she gave him a small, tearful smile, a look that said, "We did it." 3 months later, St. Jude's was unrecognizable. The name remained, but its soul had been exorcised. The iron gate stood permanently open, and the oppressive silence had been replaced by the chaotic, joyful noise of children. Therapists and counselors now walked the halls where Agnes had once stalked. The quiet room was a brightly lit art studio, its walls covered in colorful, messy paintings. Clara, who hadn't spoken for weeks after her ordeal, was now its most prolific artist, her drawings filled with suns and flowers instead of shadows. Sarah Jenkins, appointed as the interim director, stood by the window of her new office, the very room where Agnes had once ruled. She watched the children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. There were still scars, of course. Nightmares were common, and trust was a fragile thing, rebuilt one small, kind act at a time. The legal proceedings against Agnes were ongoing, and the story of St. Jude's had become a statewide scandal, a grim cautionary tale of how systemic oversight could fail so catastrophically for so long. The door creaked open, and Leo poked his head in. At 10 years old, he looked like a different boy. The perpetual tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. "Sarah," he asked, no longer calling her Miss Jenkins. "Some of the little kids are asking if you'll read to them after dinner." "Of course I will," she smiled. "Pick out a good one." He nodded, turning to leave, but paused in the doorway. He looked back at her, his expression serious. "The old logbook said Thomas liked stories about adventures," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd ever mentioned the name. He would have liked the new stories. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of the past 27 years, of the boy whose tragedy was twisted to justify decades of cruelty, still lingered. But looking at Leo, at his clear eyes and the hope that now lived in them, she knew the cycle was broken. "Yes, Leo," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think he would have." He gave her a small, genuine smile and disappeared down the hall, his footsteps light and unburdened. Sarah looked back out at the yard, at the children running free under the setting sun. The chains were gone, but the real liberation was this: the sound of a child's footsteps, no longer silent with fear, but hurrying toward the promise of a story, a new chapter waiting to be read.